It's an early autumn morning in Washington, D.C., and the sun is rising slowly over the horizon, casting a soft golden hue across the White House lawn. The crisp air smells faintly of fallen leaves, and the world seems to be waking up to a day that will feel, for some, like any other. Except that today, something remarkable is about to unfold. Have you ever wondered what it's like to grow up in the public eye? Constantly under the scrutiny of millions, every step you take followed by cameras, whispers, and opinions? Barron Trump knows this all too well. The youngest son of former President Donald Trump, Barron has always lived his life under a microscope. Yet, unlike his father or siblings, he has remained an enigma, quiet, reserved, and mostly out of the spotlight. But the world is about to see a different side of Barron. At 18, Barron is no longer the young child running around the White House with his father or sitting in the back seat of presidential cars. He's now a young man beginning to carve his own path in the world, but his journey is far from ordinary. For most teens, high school is a time to grow, to find friends, and to figure out who they are. But for Barron, it's a battlefield. The halls of his new school, an exclusive private academy, buzz with the whispers of students eager to get a glimpse of the infamous son of the former president. Some are curious, some are excited, and others, well, others are less welcoming. Barron has already learned the hard way that being different in the eyes of his peers can lead to some unwanted attention. It's here, in this world of elite students and high expectations, that the story begins. Barron's quiet demeanor and reserved nature make him a prime target for the relentless cruelty that teenage bullying often brings. For weeks, he's endured small slights and under-the-breath comments. But it isn't until one fateful day in the cafeteria that the situation escalates into something much more serious. It's in this moment, as Barron stands alone at a lunch table, eyes darting between the few empty seats around him, that something happens. A small yet significant turning point. The event that will challenge his self-control and force him to make a decision that will not only change his own life, but the lives of those around him. And it all starts with the laughter, a sound that cuts through the chatter of the cafeteria, cruel and mocking. What happens next will make everyone question what they thought they knew about Barron Trump. And it will leave the question hanging in the air. Who is Barron, really? The cafeteria was noisy, as usual. The clattering of trays, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. It was a predictable scene for any high school student. But Barron Trump, sitting in the far corner of the room, couldn't shake the feeling that today was different. He had been enduring the stares, the whispers, and the not-so-subtle comments for weeks now. But he had learned to keep his head down, to remain invisible, to survive. At a table across from him, a group of students, the so-called elite of the school, sat, their conversation punctuated by laughter that felt almost too loud, too pointed. Barron had tried to ignore it, focusing on the tray of food. In front of him, his eyes fixed on the unremarkable texture of mashed potatoes. But he could feel their eyes on him, could hear the way their laughter seemed to twist into something mocking whenever his name was mentioned. Guess who's sitting? Alone today? The presidential kid, a voice sneered. It was loud enough for Barron to hear, and the sharp edge of the words made his stomach tighten. He clenched his jaw, taking a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It's just words, he told himself. Let it go. Don't make a scene. But the laughter from the table continued, growing louder. The words were sharper now, more pointed. He could feel his pulse quicken, the heat rising in his face. Is he really this awkward in real life? Another voice chimed in, followed by another burst of laughter. I mean, does he even know how to talk to anyone who isn't a world leader? Barron's hands gripped the edges of his tray, his fingers white with tension. His breath came faster, and for a moment, He felt like the world around him was closing in. Why do they care so much? He wondered. I don't even want to be here. I just want to get through the day, get home. The laughter continued, too loud now, too pointed. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, the pressure building in his throat, the tightness in his shoulders. Barron was no stranger to judgment, but this felt different. This wasn't just about who he was. It was about his name, his family. His life was being mocked in front of everyone, and it hit him harder than he'd ever imagined. Then, unexpectedly, someone moved. A figure from the group of mockers stood up, striding toward Barron's table with a grin plastered on their face. It was Tyler, one of the more notorious kids at the school, handsome, popular, and known for his quick wit and sharp tongue. Barron's stomach dropped. He knew what was coming. Tyler had been one of the worst, the kind of kid who thrived on teasing others to make himself look better. Hey, Barron. Tyler's voice oozed with sarcasm. As he approached, the rest of his group following in tow. You know, you don't have to sit alone. We were just talking about you. You've been looking a little lonely. The words hit Barron like a punch to the gut. For a brief second, he considered getting up and walking away, pretending it didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered more than he cared to admit. As he looked up at Tyler, his hands shook, and for a moment he saw the gleam of amusement in Tyler's eyes. It was all a game to him. A cruel, unforgiving game. And then, the next words that left Tyler's mouth were the ones that would change everything. You know, I've got to say, Barron, I feel so sorry for you. Must suck, having to live up to that name. Barron's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It wasn't just about him being different or awkward. Tyler had crossed a line, bringing his father into the mockery, using Barron's name, his identity, as the punchline. Something in Barron snapped. The room seemed to go quiet for a second, like everyone around him was holding their breath. His heart raced, his fists clenched under the table, and his vision blurred with a mix of anger and something deeper, something buried for far too long. Barron had been trying so hard to ignore it, to be invisible, but today, he couldn't let it slide. Not anymore. A few of his classmates, those who had witnessed the exchange, exchanged uneasy glances. Claire, a quiet girl from his English class, who had always sat near him in the back row, was watching him now. There was sympathy in her eyes, but also something else. A quiet resolve. Barron had always found Claire's presence calming, her gentle nature, a soft contrast to the chaos of his life. She wasn't like the others, but even Claire's understanding couldn't prepare him for what was coming next. Tyler leaned in closer, his words now dripping with venom. What's the matter, Barron? You gonna cry to your daddy? Oh, wait, I forgot. You probably don't need him to bail you out this time. You've got that special privilege. The mention of his father, used as a weapon in such a cruel way, was the final straw. Barron's hand shot out before he even realized what he was doing, slamming his tray against the table, causing the silverware to rattle and food to spill onto the floor. The noise was sharp, like a gunshot in the silence that followed. Tyler took a step back, eyes wide with surprise. The laughter from his group faltered. Claire stood up, her voice cutting through the tension. Tyler, that's enough. Barron's pulse was still racing, his body shaking with adrenaline, but something inside him was different. He was no longer just the quiet, awkward kid who stayed in the background. He had finally broken the silence. And the consequences of that single moment were only just beginning to unfold. The cafeteria fell silent after Barron's outburst. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the murmurs of nearby tables seemed to quiet, as if they too were waiting for the next move. Barron's chest heaved with heavy breaths, his mind racing, but all he could hear was the blood thumping in his ears. He had done it. He had broken the silence, broken the mold of who he was supposed to be. And yet, as the tension lingered in the air, he immediately began to question himself. What had he just done? Tyler's face twisted into a mixture of shock and disdain. His friends hung back, exchanging looks that bordered on concern, but quickly turned into amusement. Barron's hand still gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale from the force. The tray of food that had once been neatly arranged in front of him was now scattered on the floor, remnants of mashed potatoes and salad littering the tile. A few students in the cafeteria whispered to each other, exchanging glances as if they were waiting for Barron to either apologize or somehow justify his reaction. Claire, who had stood up to defend him, now quietly slid back into her seat, her eyes flickering nervously between Barron and the still quiet Tyler. But Barron couldn't look at her. Not yet. He was too consumed with the feeling that had taken over him, a cocktail of anger, humiliation, and regret. His breath began to slow, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the calm before a storm. Tyler, seeing that Barron wasn't going to back down, finally spoke. His voice was venomous, dripping with mockery. I guess someone's finally learned how to stand up for himself. Shame it took you this long, though. He gave a loud laugh, and his friends joined in, though it felt empty now. The laughter didn't carry the same power as before, but Barron could feel the eyes of the entire cafeteria on him. The pressure built, pressing against his chest like a heavy weight. He didn't know what was worse, the insult from Tyler or the realization that he had just let the entire school see him lose control. The fear began to creep in, twisting in his stomach. What if I've made things worse? As the bell rang to signal the end of lunch, the tension that had been suffocating, the room didn't dissolve. Students began to gather their trays, but the undercurrent of gossip had already begun. Some students openly whispered about what had just transpired, while others exchanged knowing looks as they headed to their next class. Barron stood frozen, for a moment, watching Tyler and his group walk past, their laughter fading but not fully dissipating. He turned toward Claire, but before he could even make eye contact, she was already slipping out of the cafeteria, her head down, probably to avoid the inevitable wave of rumors. Barron couldn't blame her, though. He wasn't sure how he would face anyone now, either. The walk to his next class felt like the longest journey of his life. Barron could feel the whispers following him down the hall, the curious glances from classmates he'd never even spoken to before. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, not for anything real at least. It had always been about his name, about who his family was. But today Barron had made himself a target in a way that felt terrifyingly personal. He entered his history class. He tried to settle into his seat, hoping that, for once, he could just blend in. But the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, less discreet. One student, a boy from his physics class, leaned over and shot him a smirk. "So, Barron, you're not so quiet after all, huh?" he said under his breath. Barron turned, his head toward the window, trying to block out the noise, but he felt the weight of their eyes on him. In a way, the silence was worse than the mocking. Then came the text. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a small distraction. He pulled it out, half expecting a message from Claire, maybe even his mother, asking how he was doing. Instead, it was a news alert, the headline glaring at him from the screen. Barron Trump's public meltdown. The son of a president takes a stand against school bullies. His stomach dropped. The article was everywhere now, on the school's social media feeds, on news websites, even in his inbox. Barron couldn't escape it. The world had already started to spin the story, framing him as a troubled teen who had finally snapped under the pressure. There was no mention of what had actually happened. No one cared about the context, the months of silent humiliation, the personal toll it had taken. All that mattered was the drama. Barron sat in the back of the classroom, his phone still clutched in his hand, the words of the article flashing in his mind. He didn't want to be that kid, the one who everyone would gossip about for weeks, the one who became the subject of every social media thread. This wasn't what I wanted, he thought. I didn't want to make a scene. As the bell rang to signal the end of class, Barron stood up, his legs feeling heavy beneath him. He wanted to disappear, wanted to slip into the shadows and forget about everything. But he knew that wasn't going to happen. The rumors had taken on a life of their own, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. And worse, he wasn't sure he was ready for what was coming next. The following days were a blur for Barron. His phone constantly buzzed with texts and social media notifications, each one a reminder of the fallout from his cafeteria outburst. He had been thrust into the public eye in a way he'd never imagined, no longer just the quiet son of a former president, but the kid who had finally stood up for himself. Or, depending on who you asked, the kid who had lost his temper in front of everyone. The opinions were split, and Barron felt like he was drowning in the noise. But it wasn't just the school that had started to turn on him. The media had picked up the story, running sensationalized headlines about his meltdown, his outburst. Even some of the people who had once shown him kindness now looked at him with a mix of discomfort and pity, as though he were a walking disaster waiting to happen. His sense of isolation deepened. Then, just when Barron thought things couldn't get worse, a message came through that made his blood run cold. It was from his mother, Trump. "We need to talk. Your father wants to help with the situation at school." Barron read the text twice, his stomach sinking. Of all the things he didn't want, it was his father's intervention. His father's presence in his life had always been a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was the comfort of knowing he had someone who would always have his back, no matter what. On the other hand, there was the weight of expectations, the pressure to perform, to live up to a name that loomed large over every aspect of his existence. Barron had spent his entire life trying to avoid the spotlight, trying to prove he was more than just a Trump kid. But now, with his world spinning out of control, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face this alone. Maybe there was a way to find some balance between the public perception of who he was and who he actually wanted to be. It was a terrifying thought, but one that began to shift his perspective. The sudden clarity hit him like a wave. This was his chance to define his own narrative. He didn't have to be the subject of ridicule. He didn't have to play by everyone else's rules. He could stand up, not just for himself, but for what was right. But the question remained. What now? Would he face the world head-on, or continue to shrink away from the spotlight, hoping it would all go away? The turning point had come, and Barron had a choice to make. The day of Barron's confrontation with the school principal arrived faster than he expected. The moment had been building for days, each new headline, each new whisper adding more weight to the burden he carried. His parents, his mother especially, had pushed him to take action, to meet with the principal and talk about what had happened. At first, Barron had resisted. The last thing he wanted was more attention, more intervention. But the pressure, both external and internal, had reached a tipping point. He couldn't keep running from this. He couldn't shrink back into the shadows anymore. The world was watching, whether he liked it or not, and it was time to make a choice. Let others define him, or step forward and take control of his own story. The principal's office was quiet, too quiet. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Barron sat in one of the chairs opposite Principal Adams, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression. His eyes were kind, but there was a weight in them, a clear sense that Barron was not just any student. He was the son of a former president, and that carried consequences. "Barron, I want you to know that I understand how difficult this situation is for you. Principal Adams said, his voice measured. "I also understand that what happened in the cafeteria wasn't just an isolated incident. It's been building up for a while, hasn't it?" Barron nodded, his jaw tight. He had never been one for talking, especially about personal things. But today, as the weight of everything pressed down on him, he realized there was no avoiding the truth. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's been hard. People think they know me because of who my dad is, and they make assumptions about me, about my life, about how I'm supposed to act." He paused, swallowing the bitterness in his throat. "But I'm not my dad. I'm me." The principal watched him closely, and Barron felt a flicker of something. Something like respect, maybe. Understanding. It wasn't often that people listened to him, really listened. "I know you're not your father, Barron," the principal said, his tone softer now. "And I don't want anyone to treat you as though you are. But I also know this has been hard for you. You've been through a lot, more than most people can understand." The words cut through the tension in Barron's chest, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to exhale. "I don't need special treatment," Barron said, his voice steadier now. "But I also don't want to be the joke anymore. I want to be able to go to school, to be around people, without feeling like I'm being watched every second. Like I'm not me." Principal Adams nodded thoughtfully, his eyes softening. "We can do that, Barron. But you'll need to be part of that change. We can't force people to stop making assumptions, but we can set an example. You're more than just a name. You're a person, and it's time for others to see that." Barron's heart raced, but this time, it was different. He felt a surge of confidence, not because everything would be magically fixed, but because he had finally taken a step in the right direction. He wasn't just going to be a victim of the narrative anymore. He was going to take control. As he stood up to leave the office, a text message popped up on his phone. It was from Claire. "You okay? I saw the news. You did the right thing today. Proud of you." Barron smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. The validation wasn't from the press or from the world. It was from someone who saw him, not as a famous last name, but as a person. It felt real. His journey wasn't over. In fact, he knew the real challenge was just beginning. There would still be hurdles ahead. The school wouldn't suddenly become a paradise, and the gossip wouldn't stop overnight. But Barron had made his choice. He had confronted the pain, the fear, and the pressure head-on. And for the first time in his life, he knew he could survive it. He wasn't just Barron Trump, he was Barron. And that, he realized, was enough. Weeks passed after Barron's meeting with Principal Adams, and slowly things began to change. The whispers in the hallways didn't completely fade. Students were still curious, still prone to making assumptions. But Barron's life felt different now, not because the world had transformed, but because he had. He had confronted the bullies, yes, but more importantly, he had confronted himself. The change didn't come all at once. It was subtle, a slow shift in the way Barron carried himself. At first, there were moments of self-doubt, fleeting moments, when the weight of his name or the pressure of others' expectations threatened to pull him back into the shadows. But every time those doubts crept in, he reminded himself of the conversation in the principal's office, of the choice he had made to stop hiding. Claire, who had quietly supported him from the start, became a true ally. She was there for him, not out of obligation or pity, but because she genuinely saw him, Barron, not the son of a famous politician. She helped him navigate the rough patches, offering a smile or a word of encouragement when the days felt too heavy. Slowly, their friendship grew stronger, a quiet bond formed from mutual understanding and respect. One afternoon, as Barron was walking down the school's hallway, a group of students approached him. For a moment, his heart skipped a beat, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. But this time it was different. The students weren't sneering or whispering. They weren't mocking him. Instead, one of them, a girl he didn't know, offered him a simple nod. "Hey, Barron," she said, her voice kind. "We saw what happened. That took guts. Hope things get better for you." For a brief moment, Barron felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Acceptance. It wasn't the applause or the grand gestures he'd been waiting for, but something quieter, more genuine. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't the punchline of a joke. He was just Barron. His journey hadn't been easy. It had been painful, and it had pushed him to places he didn't want to go. But in the end, Barron had discovered something far more important than the approval of others, his own voice. As he walked through the halls, his steps no longer felt heavy. There was a lightness to them, as though the weight of other people's expectations no longer had the power to define him. And as the day faded into evening, Barron felt a sense of quiet peace wash over him. He had faced the storm, and now he was standing in the calm. In the end, he realized that the most important thing wasn't how others saw him. It was how he saw himself, and that, Barron thought, was enough.